The last 24 hours of Ted Bundy. Everybody knows who Ted Bundy is. A vicious criminal determined to inflict the most amount of pain and humiliation on his victims as possible. Bundy's capture in 1978 was a massive relief to women in the USA who no longer had to fear becoming his next target. During his time behind bars, he confessed to the slayings of 30 people, but many believe his victim count to be much higher. His own defense lawyer described him as the very definition of heartless evil. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, to Eleanor Louise Cowell at Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. Though Bundy's mother claimed she fell pregnant after meeting an Army veteran named Jack Worthington and that he later abandoned her when she learned of the pregnancy, Bundy's paternity is generally considered up for debate. A salesman and US Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall was reportedly listed on his birth certificate, but a copy of the certificate states that his father is unknown. Bundy initially grew up in Roxborough, Philadelphia. He was raised by his grandparents for 3 years because it was socially unacceptable at the time for an unwed mother to have a child. For several years, he was raised with the belief that his mother was his sister, though he eventually learned the truth when she married and took custody of him again. From a young age, he was considered odd and exhibited questionable and disconcerting behavior. In one incident, his aunt recalled waking from a nap to find that Bundy had spread kitchen knives on the bed around her. While he adored his grandfather, Samuel, he has been described as a violent bully who beat his wife, harmed neighborhood animals, and expressed racist and xenophobic opinions. He once reportedly threw his daughter Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. However, neighbors and extended family members believe that this version of Samuel didn't exist, that he was made up in order for Bundy to justify his own behavior later on. In 1950, Bundy went to Tacoma, Washington with his mother, where she met Johnny Bundy. The pair married in 1951, and he formally adopted her young son. Bundy claimed to have spent his teen years drinking alcohol, peeping into bedroom windows and looking at detective magazines and novels, searching for stories of sexual violence. He particularly enjoyed those with pictures of female corpses. Childhood friends and acquaintances alleged that he hurt both animals and other children, and that he was a bully and mean-spirited. Bundy had a brief relationship with Diane Edwards while attending university, but that ended when she observed his immaturity and lack of drive. He floated around various states afterwards and eventually discovered his birth certificate in 1969, which led him to begin resenting his mother for keeping the circumstances of his birth from him. Later that year, he met Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother to a 3-year-old daughter. Their relationship was turbulent and would continue throughout Bundy's life of crime. Elizabeth's daughter will later describe incidents of Bundy being abusive towards her, both physically and sexually, noting that he would hit her in the face, knock her to the ground, and touch her inappropriately. All of these acts were carried out as games. Bundy graduated with a psychology degree in 1972 from the University of Washington, and shortly afterwards enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, to study law. Though he hadn't scored particularly well on his LSAT, he had the backing of several governors he'd worked and campaigned for during his time at university, as well as the support of his lecturers from UW. Though he maintained his relationship with Elizabeth, he also began dating his ex-girlfriend, Diane Edwards. She was impressed by his newfound determination, but in 1974, he abruptly ended the relationship by going no contact with her. When she finally reached him a month later, he had little to say to her. Bundy would later reflect that he simply wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her. That same year, Bundy slowly stopped attending classes at his law school and instead embarked on a life of crime. While it's unclear when exactly Bundy began killing, as he gave different dates to different people, the first murder victim that we know of was 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, a University of Washington undergraduate. On the morning of February the 1st, 1974, Bundy broke into her room, beat her unconscious, dressed her in clothing, and carried her to his car. He later stated that he drove her to a secluded area where she was raped and murdered before he abandoned her body. Over the next few years, Bundy took the lives of dozens of young women who were barely out of high school. The majority of his victims were college students between the ages of 15 and 25, and all of them were white, usually from middle-class backgrounds. Bundy was known for his meticulous and calculating nature when it came to murder. He killed all across the US, operating in California, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Utah, Washington, and Oregon, which served to confuse investigators who were used to killers staying in a single area. For years, authorities believed they were chasing numerous different individuals, which hindered the case greatly. Another obstacle that delayed Bundy's arrest was the fact that the police did not believe he was capable of committing the crimes. Numerous people, including his girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, his ex-colleague, Anne Rule, and one of his psychology professors, told the police that Bundy fit the description of the man they were looking for. However, investigators refused to believe that a law student with no criminal history could be responsible. While Bundy started out breaking into homes and committed violence on sleeping victims, he would later go to much greater lengths to snag his targets. He often posed as an injured individual with a cast on his leg, his arm in a sling, or even using crutches, and asked his victims for their help in carrying books and other items to his car. Once they were near to or inside his car, a Volkswagen Beetle, he would overpower them, attack them, and place them in handcuffs. They'd then be transported to another site where they were raped and killed. He often burned the clothing of his victims afterwards to eliminate incriminating evidence, and would visit the murder scene multiple times in order to sexually abuse the corpses. Bundy typically assaulted his victims by blunt force trauma or strangulation, and avoided using guns because they were loud, attention-grabbing, and much easier for the police to identify and track. His fingerprints were never left at a crime search, and he was known to research the areas he attacked in so that he could establish a safe space to kill and dispose of his victims. In August 1975, Bundy was pulled over by the police while in Utah, having moved there to enroll at a different law school. Inside the vehicle, authorities discovered a ski mask, crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, ice pick, and other items that caused them alarm. A detective recognized Bundy's name from one of the many reports made about him by Elizabeth, and a search of his apartment turned up advertisements and brochures for locations where several victims had gone missing. He was soon arrested and charged with the kidnapping of Carol DeRonch, an 18-year-old telephone operator who'd escaped from Bundy's car. He was given a 15-year sentence for the offense, but in 1977, he escaped twice from prison. The second time was in December, and he was not noticed missing for 15 hours. In January 1978, Bundy was still on the run. In Tallahassee, Florida, he he broke into a sorority house and attacked 4 young women, killing Margaret Bauman and Lisa Levy. On February the 9th, he killed his final victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Later that month, he was finally captured and rearrested, and bite marks on the body of one of his victims from the sorority house became evidence that he could not deny or talk his way out of. Lead prosecutor Larry Simpson would later remark, "I think the bite mark itself is indicative of the primal rage that Mr. Bundy must have been in at the time that he committed those murders. It was just a total homicidal rage." In July 1979, Bundy was convicted for the murders of Margaret Bauman and Lisa Levy, as well as 3 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death for his crimes. For the next 9 years, he attempted to appeal his sentence, but instead was given another death sentence after he was convicted for the killing of Kimberly Leach. Despite his arrest, Bundy wound up marrying Carol Ann Boone in 1980 while in the middle of a trial, because she'd accepted the proposal before a judge, the vow as legally binding in Florida. Carol was a mother of 2 who'd been seeing Bundy even while he was dating Elizabeth Klopfer, having met in 1974 in Olympia, Washington. She gave birth to the couple's only child, Rose, in 1982. Initially, there was some question about the paternity of the baby, but it quickly emerged that the prison guards could not be bribed to look the other way when the couple wanted some one-on-one time during Carol's visits to the prison. For years, she believed that Bundy had been wrongly prosecuted, but in 1986, she seemed to finally see the truth. She divorced him and moved to Washington with their daughter. Death row, final days, and death. In April of 1986, Bundy's execution date was set for July the 2nd. It was at this point that the serial killer finally began to admit some of the most gruesome and awful details about his crimes that he had not yet discussed, including his tendency to sexually abuse corpses and the way in which he would dress the bodies up by painting their nails, applying makeup, and washing their hair. He also revealed that he decapitated around 12 of his victims and kept a group of heads in his home for some time before eventually disposing of them. Just hours before Bundy was set to be executed, however, it was stayed indefinitely and further legal issues arose and were dealt with. Eventually, he exhausted all his appeal options and he once again sat down with investigators and revealed that he had killed far more than 3 people whose murders he was convicted of. His lawyer later remarked, his murders were his life's accomplishments. This time though, while speaking with investigators, Bundy wasn't quite so candid. He opted to withhold numerous details about the murders in the hopes that he could wriggle out of his death sentence. Though his lawyers advised him not to do this, as it would eventually turn investigators and court officials against him, he did so anyway. He would tell them that there were remains buried in a state, but offer no further details, offering meagre breadcrumbs of information and believing he would be granted another stay of execution. However, investigators did not take the bait, and his sentence was fixed for January of 1989. On Bundy's last day alive, he granted a videotaped interview to James Dobson, a psychologist and founder of the Christian evangelical organization Focus on the Family, established in 1977. The group advocates for abstinence and old-fashioned gender roles, lobbies against LGBTQ+ rights, and seeks to change public policy when it comes to sex education, abortion, and creationism. Upon speaking with Dobson, Bundy began claiming that his crimes had stemmed from an overconsumption of pornography, claiming that once he became addicted to it, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material, until you reach a point where the pornography only goes so far, where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it would give that which is beyond just reading and looking at it. While Dobson completely bought into Bundy's story, investigators and biographers believe that the killer was simply trying to appease the interviewer while also attempting to blame something, anything, rather than take responsibility for the crimes he committed. Over the years, those who interviewed Bundy concluded that although he admitted to committing 30 murders, he never actually took accountability for any of them. He often blamed an abusive grandfather, a lack of a father figure, the fact that his mother had hidden his identity from him, anything but himself. He even tried blaming his own victims, telling Elizabeth in a letter in 1977, "I have known people who radiate vulnerability. Their facial expressions say, 'I am afraid of you.' These people invite abuse. By expecting to be hurt, do they subtly encourage it?" Later that evening, Bundy called his mother twice. At the time of his arrest, she'd been working as a secretary at the University of Puget Sound, and she'd refused to believe that her son was the vicious killer the police were claiming him to be. Like Carol Ann Boone, it wasn't until he confessed, with his execution date looming ever closer, that she finally realized who he was and what he'd done. Louise stated, "We believed in him. We wanted to believe him. He's still our son, no matter what he's done, and we love him very much." She reportedly told him on the phone, "You'll always be my precious son." She declined to attend his execution as it would have been too distressing for her, and later told a reporter, "It's a circus, and we didn't feel the agony we would go through by going down there would compensate for a few minutes talking to Ted through the glass, and he felt that way too." Notably, Bundy also attempted to contact the mother of his child. Carol had been reportedly devastated by his confessions and also resented that he had started dating someone else following the divorce. The woman in question, Diane Weiner, petitioned on his behalf by trying to convince the families of his victims to request that his execution be postponed so that he had more time to reveal further information. None of the families bought what she and her boyfriend were selling, however, and Florida Governor Bob Martinez told reporters that he would not agree to further delays in the execution, stating, "We are not going to have the system manipulated." For him to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable. Though Bundy was offered a final meal, he turned it down, and so he was given a standard meal of steak, eggs, hash browns, and toast. However, he reportedly declined to eat it. The night before he died, he discussed suicide, with one detective noting, "He did not want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die." Bundy's last words were given to his lawyer, Jim Coleman, and a minister named Fred Lawrence. He stated, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Outside of Florida State Prison, an excited mob of 500 people armed with beer and wearing t-shirts with slogans like "Burn Bundy" gathered in anticipation. They would later sing and chant songs, dance, and set off fireworks as the execution was carried out, celebrating even more loudly when the hearse containing his body departed from the prison. But it wasn't just the groups huddled outside the prison that were celebrating. The sorority house at Florida State University that had lost 2 of its members back in 1978 hosted a massive cookout where they served Bundy burgers and electrified hot dogs, while police officers in Alabama held a Bundy queue. Bundy was executed via an electric chair known as Old Sparky, on January the 24th, 1989, and pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. His death was witnessed by 42 people. He was cremated in Gainesville, Florida, and no public ceremony was held. Bundy had written in his will that he wished for his ashes to be scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, notably an area where he disposed of around 4 of his victims. There are conflicting accounts about whether or not this request was fulfilled. Following his execution, Bundy's brain was removed and examined in the name of science. Robert Keppel, an investigator who worked on the Green River killer case and interacted with Bundy, described his bloodlust as something which surged over him in chemical tidal waves, like a craving for a narcotic. This led to speculation that there was something physically wrong or different about Bundy that set him apart from regular people. Forensic anthropologist William Maples noticed halo-shaped marks on his head, but this was simply from the electric chair, as was the large mass of congealed blood on top of the brain. Maples stated that he did not, in fact, find anything out of the ordinary, observing, when it was finally removed and examined, Ted Bundy's brain looked like anyone else's.